Welcome to our second Premodern Korea lecture series. I'm Jisoo Kim, Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I direct the GW Institute for Korean Studies and co-direct the East Asian National Resource Center. Before I introduce our speaker today, I think our audience did receive an email about this, but I would like to also mention that we have changed from a webinar format to a regular meeting format. So what this means is that our audience can join us on screen during the Q&A session. So when we use the webinar format, I have to take questions from the Q&A box from the audience and read it to the speaker. But instead of doing that, I would like to ask our audience to directly ask your questions to our speaker. During the Q&A session, you can turn on your video and audio and directly engage in discussion with our speaker. So this way, we can have more lively discussions. But if you still want to, if you prefer to use the chat box, please feel free to leave your comments or any questions that you might have there as well. All right, now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Graham Reynolds. I'm so delighted to have him with us today. Dr. Reynolds is a cultural and intellectual historian of early modern Korea with interest in the production and circulation of knowledge, the history of the book, and historiography. His book manuscript, Material Historiography, the Official Histories of Koryå from their compilation to the present, examines the production, circulation, reception of two court histories treating the Koryå dynasty, the history of Koryå, and the essentials of Koryå history from their contested compilation in the early Chosŏn period to their effective canonization in a plethora of modern editions and databases in our digital present. His second project has been an investigation into Chosŏn Korea's state-dominated and heavily non-commercial publishing economy, where woodblock, movable type, and handwriting were all viable methods of making books. He received his BA in Asian Area Studies from the UBC and University of British Columbia, and holds an MA in Korean History from the Academy of Korean Studies and a PhD in History and East Asian Languages from Harvard University. Prior to coming to the University of Chicago, Dr. Reynolds was a Korea Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Yale University. All right, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Graham.
Oh, thank you very much for the warm welcome and introduction, and also thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to share my screen. There. All right, so I'm honored to be able to speak to you today about my research, and I'm going to just be revealing a glimpse of my first book project, which, as briefly mentioned just now, is an examination of the production and reception of two official histories about Korea's medieval dynasty, Koryå. So I doubt I have to remind many in the audience that for a millennium prior to the turn of the 20th century, the Korean peninsula was dominated by two dynasties, the Koryå and the Chosŏn. Koryå lasted for 475 years, from 918 to 1392, weathering internal rebellion, military power holders, and the Mongol invasions. It was not until an enterprising general staged a coup d'etat and founded the Chosŏn dynasty that the Koryå falls. Chosŏn ruled the peninsula from 1392 until 1910, enduring a number of international upheavals, including a massive invasion by Japan at the end of the 16th century. And this dynastic transition between the two, from Koryå into Chosŏn, has occupied historians for a long time. And often preeminent is the question of whether the change of dynasties constituted a genuine social revolution led by a new scholar official class with a Neo-Confucian agenda, or whether it was merely a palace coup, in other words, a minor rearrangement of the prior order. But the reason I want to highlight the Koryå-Chosŏn transition is because the newly founded Chosŏn court embarked on an extensive program of historical compilations. Dynastic transitions are moments of flux for history writing. Historically, Chinese states had compiled histories of preceding dynasties, and one example of such histories was the history of Yuan, the Yuanshi, compiled by the Ming Dynasty of China in 1370, just shortly before Chosŏn was founded. By this means, new dynastic polities used the writing of history to bring order to the archives of the old regime and symbolically claim ownership over the history of the fallen state. Drawing on this venerable Sinitic precedent and other homegrown examples of history writing, the Chosŏn court set out to conquer Koryō history, as the monarchs and the officials complicit in the change of regime sought to solidify their legacy. Accordingly, the new court swiftly began work on a history of its predecessor. However, writing a history of Koryō proved contentious. Eventually, some 6 decades after the founding of the new dynasty, a series of repeated compilation attempts and some failures resulted in 2 official histories. The first is the massive 137-chapter History of Koryō, completed in 1451. The contents of the History of Koryō were divided into annals, treatises, timetables, and biographies, and this division was typical of official histories in China, such as the aforementioned History of Yuan. The second book is the smaller 35-chapter Essentials of Koryō History, the Koryåsa chåryo, which was completed in 1452. And the Essentials is just a straight chronicle of events during the Koryō. And I will refer to these 2 books as the History and the Essentials respectively throughout the talk. Both histories were important projects of legitimation for the early Chosŏn court, and this was not only due to the symbolic power of compiling a history of the fallen dynasty, but also because they confirmed the new state's legitimacy by portraying 2 of the last Koryō kings as usurpers and referring to them by name rather than by title. Significantly, both histories are also critical sources for Korean history today, and it is extremely difficult to write on the history of the Koryō kingdom without recourse to these 2 histories, and virtually impossible to escape their historiographic and conceptual shadow. As such, there are a plethora of modern editions, both print and digital, and the slide here shows the Koryō Historical Materials Database that includes, of course, the history, which is marked on blue on the left-hand side, and the essentials, which is marked on the red, in red, in the kind of red box on the right. This database is hosted by the Guksapyeonshin Riwonhwae, the National Institute for Korean History. Moreover, the history of Koryō itself is designated as a treasure by South Korea's Cultural Heritage Administration as of 2021. So effectively, both histories are canon, both in terms of the number of new editions and their importance in Korean in the canon of Korean classics, and then also like officially according to the South Korean government. So these 2 books were important political compilations in their own day and important sources in the modern era. And as such, it is common to assume that their status throughout the course of the Chosŏn dynasty was paramount. And the general idea is that both histories became essential readings for the Chosŏn literati, that is, they were widely read. So my research challenges the notion that the 2 histories of Koryō were continuously available for literati consumption, and I argue that the circulation of each of the 2 histories was divergent and uneven. And in so doing, I rewrite our understanding of their significance and impact in the Chosŏn. My project thus uncovers an untold history of reception obscured by the present-day ubiquity of reprints of the 2 works through an investigation into the publication and reception of the history and the essentials in the Chosŏn period. I argue that neither history enjoyed absolute supremacy and that their importance was contingent on many factors, not least court policy and literati interest. Initially, court policy dictated that the circulation of the 2 histories was to be restricted, resulting in a limited number of movable type imprints of the history and a slightly larger number of copies of the essentials that tended to be accessible only to a central officialdom throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. Eventually, the court relaxed its attitude and permitted the publication of a new woodblock edition of the history in the 17th century, drastically broadening its readership as literati were able to procure their own copies of the work. The essentials, while initially having a slightly larger circulation, was not reprinted and rapidly fell from the public eye. In other words, the history went from a restricted source to a published archive, but the essentials, on the other hand, changed from a semi-restricted source to the category of rare book. And this resulted in an uneven temporal and geographic distribution of each book, which impacted their readership, reception, and utilization in the writing of the Korean past, at least outside of the court. The trajectories of the history and the essentials highlight how media ecologies create uneven outcomes of distribution, perhaps similar to the paywalls of academic journals, or how the publication of archival materials or their restriction creates new opportunities and limitations for history writing now. This new narrative of the two histories forces us to reconsider the history of Chosŏn era history writing, that is, early modern Korean historiography. Rather than seeking explanations for changes in history writing purely in philosophical currents, political factions, and the increasing Confucianization of Korea, which of course are all very important parts of the narrative, I argue that it was the changes in availability and accessibility of source materials that spurred certain developments in history writing. In particular, the widespread publication of a restricted source in the form of the History of Koryō catalyzed new ventures in private history writing in the late Chosŏn. To track the circulation and reception of the two histories, I take material bibliography as a key methodology. I examined over 100 call numbers of Chosŏn-era editions of the History of Koryō and the Essentials of Koryō History during my fieldwork in Japan and Korea in 2018 and 2019. I consider the physical properties of the different copies of the two works, such as edition, size, paper, binding, printing quality, and damage by water or fire. I analyze seals and ownership inscriptions and other handwritten marginal notes left by readers. And you can see some of the clues I mentioned on the example images on the slide. There are seals of ownership on all three, some fire damage on the leftmost copy of the history, and wear, tear, and repair, along with annotations on the right-hand page. Gathering all such evidence, I make an argument for the uneven circulation and reception of the history and the essentials. To supplement this, I also take up books that drew upon the two court histories of Koryō, ranging from high-profile private histories to personal notebooks, and scour collected works for references to these texts. By examining the traces left by readers on the page, recompilations or references in other works, I reread the history and the essentials through the eyes of contemporaries to show how Chosŏn elites read and wrote their history. In this talk, I will primarily focus on the pattern of publication and circulation of the history completed in 1451 and the essentials completed in 1452, and then hint at some of the significance of this pattern. Extant copies of the two histories reveal that they each have two editions. That is, they were each printed twice. The court printed the History of Koryō around or after 1456 with movable type. A century and a half later, the court used woodblocks to reprint the History of Koryō in 1613, after which the blocks seem to have lasted about a century and a half. The court printed the Essentials of Koryō History in 1453 and 1542, both times with movable type. There's a small mystery here. Of course, it's very interesting that the Chosŏn court only printed either of the two histories once in a few centuries. After all, both were compiled with great effort to solidify a suitable historical narrative to buttress the legitimacy of the Chosŏn. Why not print them more often? Moreover, this pattern of production is a far cry from the latter half of the 20th century, when virtually every decade the history and the essentials have a new edition each. But what is just as curious is the choice of the medium of reproduction. While Korea had a long tradition of using woodblocks, the early Chosŏn printings of the two histories, that is, all the printings prior to the 17th century, were done with movable type. Korea is, of course, well known for its regular use of movable type in contrast to its neighbors. In both China and Japan, woodblock was overwhelmingly dominant and movable type relegated to niche markets or occasional prestige projects. Even in Korea, woodblocks remained a primary method of print production. However, movable type was a frequently used viable method of book production in Chosŏn. So why is this the case? A partial explanation can be found in the fact that movable type began to be connected to the legitimacy of the Chosŏn monarchy. Improvements in typecasting and new fonts came to symbolize the sagacity of the ruler, as the early Chosŏn kings boasted of their accomplishments in typecasting and printing. Typography then could be a legitimating symbol in its own right, and I discussed this in an upcoming article, and I'm happy to speak more about it during the Q&A. The penchant for typography due to its symbolic value is only one part of the story, however. It might explain why Chosŏn used movable type more often than its neighbors, but not why it used typography for specific projects. Fortunately, contemporary voices hint at the motivation to use woodblock or movable type. Chosŏn elites frequently expressed a preference for woodblock, considering it a reliable method of transmission, as the blocks remained even after printing. Moreover, woodblocks could also include images, and they could permit longer print runs over time, thus allowing for a larger audience. And all of these reasons were cited in court documents when discussing the advantages of woodblock to print certain texts that were aimed at a wide audience. In contrast, it was common wisdom in the Chosŏn that movable type could not last long. Literati often indicated the ephemerality of movable type, arguing that it, quote, was destroyed as it was printed, end quote. And this seems somewhat counterintuitive to us moderns, perhaps. After all, both methods produce prints, and wouldn't metal type last longer than woodblock? But the logic of the Chosŏn elites become clearer when both technologies are placed side by side. With movable type, individual characters or letters are pieced together to make a text, but are taken apart after printing. And you can see the individual pieces divided up character by character in their boxes on the image on the left-hand side. On the other hand, with woodblock, as seen on the right-hand side, the text is fixed in a stable format, although of course you can modify woodblocks as well by cutting pieces out and putting in plugs. But according to the argument of the Chosŏn literati, movable type did not provide permanence, but it did have an advantage. It could be used to quickly provide a small print run with a relatively low cost, at least a low cost compared to carving a whole new set of woodblocks. And thus, movable type was seen as a more flexible method to produce a variety of different books. Given these contemporary notions of the utility of typography and xylography, I argue that the choice of medium highlights the priorities of the Chosŏn government. The choice of movable type to print the two histories that the Chosŏn court of the 15th century did not expect or desire wide circulation of either history, at least not beyond a small circle of elites. Typography, a conveniently prestigious technology, would enable the right print run with the right panache. It was, of course, possible for the government to continue to reprint with movable type and distribute the work, as it did when it reprinted the Essentials of Koryå History in the mid-16th century. It was also possible to create a woodblock edition modeled on the movable type prints, as it did with other court histories and as it did with the History of Koryõ in the 17th century. But the fact that the Chosŏn court did not continuously reprint either history, nor make woodblocks of either until the 1613 xylographic edition of the History of Koryõ, suggests a particular policy choice. The early Chosŏn court did not want either history to circulate outside the upper echelons of the government. That is, it wanted control over the historical information. And additional evidence, textual evidence, bears this out. The Chosŏn government did seem to be reluctant to permit a wide circulation of the history of Koryõ, at least, and to a lesser extent, perhaps, the Essentials of Koryå History. And after all, the Essentials had two editions. On record, very few officials suggested that the court promote wider circulation of either history. In part, this was because concern persisted about how Koryõ's imperial nomenclature might cause offense were the book to be leaked abroad. Now, what do I mean by that? Let us turn to the compilation of the two works for a moment. For the early Chosŏn officials, compiling a history of the former dynasty was a highly politicized, decades-long project, the purpose of which was the curation of the correct narrative of the fall of Koryõ. And I already mentioned the political framing of two of the last kings of Koryõ. They were called by name, not by their title, as they were considered usurpers born of a false bloodline. The image on the slide is that of the records of the third to last king of Koryō, recorded by his name Shin-U, or his ostensible name, I should say, Shin-U, and relegated to the last few chapters in the history in order to delegitimize his status as a legitimate king. And for the record, the last few chapters of the history contain the biographies of traitors, so you can see the late or the early Chosŏn elite's opinion of the last two of the last kings. So control of the correct narrative was paramount, but another issue that plagued the compilation of the two histories was the question of adherence to Koryō era imperial terminology. That is, words that placed the rulers of Koryō on par with the Son of Heaven in China. And there are many differences of nomenclature that differentiate an imperial state from a feudal tributary. But a key example is the use of temple names for the ancestral temples, for sacrifices to the royal ancestors. And temple names for imperial states will use the sinographs for ancestor, chong or cho in the Korean pronunciation. And again, these are ostensibly reserved for the ruling house of imperial dynasties. And kingdoms were supposed to use the term king or wang. The Koryō had more or less consistently used imperial terminology, including temple names, for much of its existence, and well, up until the Mongol invasions. Once the Mongols had conquered Koryō, they forced the terminology to be downgraded to that of a feudal state. The two images on the slide should give some idea of what I mean, although both are from the history. The left-hand image shows the title of the Koryō ruler during one of the phases when imperial terminology was used. The king was called Taejo, Cho character indicating an imperial temple name. On the right is an image of the records when Koryō was using royal terminology in the wake of the Mongol invasions and retreat. And you can see the Kongmin Wang has the Wang character, but no Cho or Chong. So whether to use Koryō era in the terminology or rewrite history to adhere to the contemporary world order, because Chosŏn at this time is trying to negotiate its identity via Ming and is positioning itself more as a kingdom rather than an empire, so to speak. And this caused a lot of consternation about whether to use Koryō era in terminology in history writing. So there were many advocates to rewrite history to adhere to the contemporary world order. And this was a fierce debate during much of the compilation process. In the end, Chosŏn compilers adhered to Koryō terminology in the final compilations of the history and the essentials, but they were wary of the indiscriminate use of imperial terms, and they feared that such implicit claims of equality might cause friction with China's Ming dynasty. So, although the Chosŏn compilers generally followed the phrasing of Koryō sources and thus included imperial terminology, the compilers also framed both histories in a light that downplayed Koryō's imperial claims, so as not to overstep Chosŏn's bounds in the world order dominated by the Ming. Looking at the images on the slide, here are examples from the History of Yuan and the History of Koryō. Both use imperial temple names, Taizu in the case of the History of Yuan, and Munjong in the case of the History of Koryō. But then eagle-eyed observers will note that the category they are placed under is different. The History of Yuan uses the category basic annals, bunji in Chinese or ponggi in Korean, which indicates the ruling house of the Son of Heaven in official historiography. But the History of Koryō uses the term hereditary houses, shujia in Chinese or sega in Korean, which designates feudal vassals. By using this paratextual sleight of hand, the Chosŏn compilers tried to distance themselves from Koryō's imperial claims. The Essentials does not do this, but its editorial notes also hint at compiler concern about having included imperial terms. So this kind of compromise irrevocably put a slant on the information provided in the two texts, resulting in contradictory compilations. The two histories of Koryō were monuments to the legitimacy of the Chosŏn government that still contained information that put it at odds with an idealized Sinocentric world order, or at the very least might provoke Ming's reaction. But beyond the fear of the Ming, which was a definite concern, officials expressed additional worries and opposed the circulation of at least the history of Koryõ. And these concerns revolved around who might read about examples of rebels, current events, that is kind of contemporary history, and victories and defeats in war. And the implication is that people might see examples of rebellion, contemporary history, strategic information, and the like, and based on this, move against the Chosŏn state. History could provide the wrong lessons in the wrong hands, or at least that's what some at court were saying. And they might not really have been entirely wrong because of an early, well, there's a treason case that kind of proves their point. The early Chosŏn general Nam-i, I argue, confirmed suspicions that circulating the history of Koryõ was problematic. And here you see a colorful portrayal of Nam from his shrine, which exists in Seoul today. Nam was accused of plotting against the throne in 1468. And during his torture and interrogation, he confessed that he had read the history of Koryõ. And in particular, from his reading, he had concluded that an early Koryõ coup d'etat, an enthronement of a new king, had actually been a good thing in retrospect. And the incident in question was the dethronement of Mokjong by Kangjo and company, and then their enthronement of a new king back at the turn of the 11th century. But of course, him saying this implied that he himself had similar designs to eliminate the reigning king of his era. And, you know, whether Nam's confession was true or not, it's kind of suspicious, it's obtained under torture, it did likely stoke the court's fear of letting people learn the wrong lessons from history. So most officials opposed the circulation of the history, and there's one notable exception, Yang Songji. Yang was an official and expert in cartography, and not coincidentally a compiler who participated in the production of both the history and the essentials. And he favored the circulation and of the history and dismissed worries about its examples of rebellion. And he even said, like, look, you know, all histories have examples of rebellion. Why are we worried? And so he suggests in a memorial a wider circulation for the history, perhaps even to the extent of including it in the curriculum for Chosŏn civil service examination. Yet in a separate memorial a few years later, Yang also stated that the history ought not be lightly shown to people, suggesting that his idea of circulation was merely a larger segment of the Yangban elite, not a mass audience. And again, he's the most vocal proponent of circulating the history, and there's no evidence that the court actually took these particular proposals of him seriously, although he was a major player in his time. So somewhat ironically, despite having spent decades crafting the narrative of the history and the essentials to legitimize its founding, the Chosŏn court still considered the information contained in the two histories sensitive enough to avoid casual circulation, either because it contradicted a Sinocentric worldview or because people might use it against the throne. I argue that this concern for the security of historical information governed the choice of movable type as a method of reproduction. The necessary imprints could be made without the creation of woodblocks, keeping access restricted. Likewise, fear of widespread circulation governed the choice not to move ahead with any potential woodblock addition. This is comparable to the practices surrounding the veritable records, or the shilluk, although the status of the history of Koryõ never obtained that of the shilluk. The shilluk veritable records are top secret histories of the Chosŏn compiled after the death of a reigning king. In their compilation and storage, strict secrecy was enforced and access restricted. Not even the king of Chosŏn could read these records, and high officials could do so only at great need. After compilation, drafts of the records were destroyed. From the early Chosŏn, the veritable records were also, and intriguingly, printed with movable type in print runs of 4 to 5 copies. Movable type, considered ephemeral, thus could be at times used as a method to keep information under control, perhaps even a method for secrecy, unlike the possibilities for continuous reproduction contained in woodblocks. To drive this point home, I should point out that the Chosŏn state could and did make woodblocks for other court-compiled histories. For instance, in the latter half of the 15th century, the court began the compilation of the 56th chapter Comprehensive Mirror of the Eastern Country, the Dongguk Tonggam, a chronicle from all of the past polities from the Korean Peninsula from antiquity onward. Upon its completion in 1485, the Comprehensive Mirror of the Eastern Country was initially printed with movable type, but soon had woodblocks made for it, at least by the early half of the 16th century. Similarly, the Chosŏn court also produced books of morality to try and teach Confucian ethics to the general populace, such as the illustrated guide to the three relationships shown on the slide, the Samgang Hengshildo. And these were mass-produced using woodblock, and included images in the vernacular scripts to maximize the audience. In short, it would have been entirely possible to create woodblocks for either the two histories of the Koryō had the Chosŏn court wanted to, as the state utilized woodblock print media to reach a wide audience on numerous other occasions. The choice of movable type then indicates the aim of restricted or semi-restricted access to historical information, which is backed up by the textual records that I cited earlier. But by this logic, the Chosŏn government's order to carve woodblocks for the history of Koryō in the early 17th century indicates a change in attitude towards its circulation. Why choose woodblocks at this time? And part of this willingness to utilize xylography can be attributed to the rush to resupply the peninsula and its government with books after the devastation of the late 16th century Japanese invasions. Another factor in the choice of woodblocks may have been the limited stock of movable type available in the early 17th century, which is also attributable to the invasions because Hideyoshi's forces took back the government's stock of type. However, when pressed, the court could scrape together enough mismatched fonts or wooden type, such as when it printed the veritable records in the aftermath of the Japanese retreat. Yet just as importantly, government records of this time show no indication of concern over appropriate terminology or fear of having the wrong person read the history of Koryō. This suggests that the information was no longer perceived as sensitive. The devastation of the invasions may have prompted a fear of loss and an increased awareness of national identity. I use that term hesitantly. That led to a more permissive attitude towards the history. Even so, there is no evidence for a concentrated campaign of distribution of the history of Koryō, and the Chosōn court initially printed only a handful of copies for government use. A willingness to permit the creation of woodblocks did not equal a sustained effort to distribute. But the existence of the woodblocks allowed enterprising literati to have their own copies printed, for instance by contributing extra paper to offset production costs. This form of print on demand resulted in a small but steady stream of copies of the history while the blocks lasted. The different conjunctions of politics and printing technology before and after the turn of the 17th century led to divergent patterns of availability over the course of the Chosŏn dynasty. A limited number of imprints for both histories in the 15th and 16th centuries, with a slight advantage going to the Essentials of Koryō History due to 2 editions, followed by an expansion of production of the History of Koryō from the 17th century onward, while the Essentials of Koryō History rapidly became rare because no new edition was printed, and I believe that's because no complete edition existed on the peninsula in the aftermath of the Japanese invasions. So the numbers of the extant copies of the 2 histories bear this out. Woodblock imprints of the history of Koryō outnumber the combined total of all movable type imprints of both the history and the essentials several times over. In South Korea, there are 8 call numbers with extant copies of the movable type edition of the history of Koryō. There are 9 call numbers of the 1453 edition of the essentials and 2 call numbers of the 1542 edition, for a total of 11. On the other hand, there are some 74 call numbers with copies of the woodblock edition of the history of Koryō. Bear in mind that these are all from public institutions or else registered as cultural heritage. There are almost certainly more copies held privately, and in subsequent digital surveys, I've managed to find one or two more, including like auction records of History of Koryō copies to private individuals. So there's more out there. And of course, I mentioned that I saw over 100 different call numbers. This does not quite add up to 100, and that's because I'm not talking about manuscript copies here. There are a scattering of manuscript copies, and most of which are produced in the very late Chosŏn. And I would welcome a question about these manuscript copies during the Q&A. So that's the quantitative evidence. The qualitative evidence confirms the pattern of circulation, but provides more nuance. Copies of the 1456 movable type edition of the History of Koryō show very few traces of being handled or read, and what marks exist indicate that they were stored in government repositories or offices. So overwhelmingly, these were government copies. But there's two lone volumes of the massive history that must have circulated outside of court. But these have been actually turned into scrap paper, and their main text is ignored. And I argue that this suggests a somewhat anemic circulation outside of the court. And of course, there may have been other copies of the History of Koryō that circulated at that time, but were subsequently destroyed during wars, rebellions, or other catastrophes. And likely there were. The question is to exactly to what extent they circulated. And here, the Essentials of Koryō History with its two editions is an instructive point of comparison. Some extant copies of the Essentials were housed in government repositories or offices such as the Office of Royal Lectures, the Kyongyeon, as seen on the slide's left-hand image, which shows a 1453 edition with the Office of Royal Lectures Kyongyeon seal. However, there are quite a number that also bear the seals or marginalia by private individuals, or at least officials owning them personally. And I provide one example here, and that is of Kim Soo-jun. Epithet is Chongwon, and he was active during the early 16th century. And Kim Soo-jun's seals are on the right-hand side here. And this is a 1542 edition of the Essentials. Since the Essentials of Koryō History shows this pattern, I argue that had the 15th century movable type edition of the History of Koryō circulated in a similar fashion, we would expect extant volumes to have at least some indication of private use, but that is not the case, with the exception of scrap paper. This suggests that the Chosŏn government continued to restrict the circulation of the history more than the Essentials of Koryō History, and that the Essentials circulated more widely than the history amongst elites outside of a court context in the 15th and 16th centuries. This situation reverses in the late Chosŏn. The 1613 woodblock edition of the History of Koryō shows evidence of robust and diverse circulation. There are a few well-preserved and unannotated copies that were held in government offices or storehouses. The image you see here is one of those copies. It has a prominent seal, kind of on the left-hand page image with in the text area. It says Record of Royal Bestowal, Sonsaji Ki. The other seals are library seals from the modern era. And then the inscription on the right-hand side says Wanli 41, 9th month, we bestowed a copy of the History of Koryō onto Odaesan Mountain's History Repository, and then has the signature of the official down in the corner, the official responsible for depositing it. So this is one copy that was held in a government storehouse, and it's basically in perfect condition because nothing ever happened to it subsequently. But there are less pristine copies also held by the government as well. For instance, I found a copy formerly held by the Crown Prince Tutorial Office, the Chunbang, or the Library of the Royal Academy. The Songkyungwan also had a copy, and so on. But even more numerous are copies that have ownership marks from private individuals. And the diversity shows a range of circulation that penetrates deep into the literate stratum beyond high officialdom. So on the left-hand side, you have a copy that was owned by a well-known intellectual, An Chong-bok. and he is not alone. There were other career officials or intellectuals who had different copies of the history of Koryō. But there is also seals of individuals we know nothing about. So on the right-hand side, there's the seals of somebody called Che Kyu-in, who seems to be of the Incheon Choi family, but who is Che Kyu-in of Incheon. I can't find anything about him in other records, at least so far. So we might not ever know. The only record I really have of him are these seals here. I did confirm that the generational characters, the Hangyol of the Incheon Che lineages, do permit the combination of Kyu-in, but that's about it. And there's many other examples, and I won't have time to go into them all here. But I do want to note that lineages themselves sometimes own copies of the history of Koryō. There was one copy that had seals from the Hansan-i family's lineage organization. And significantly, a fair number also have ownership inscriptions from local schools, hyangyo, and sometimes private academies, so on. And both of these are important educational institutions in the Chosŏn, and both of these often had libraries with a varying degree of completeness. On the slide, there's one example from a local school's inscription, which is different than many of the other seals. You have like an official seal, the red kind of basically illegible ink is the official seal, presumably of the county. But then it says Milyang Kyo Sang, so it's kind of property of Milyang local school. And Milyang is of course close to Busan. I've identified some 13 other local schools as well, along with 5 private academies. And intriguingly, most of the copies that came from the local schools or the academies come from the southern part of the peninsula. So, in the late Chosŏn, the woodblock edition of the History of Koryō circulated amongst a far wider spectrum of the elite, including scholars we know little to nothing about, as well as schools. The opportunities to read the history of Koryō thus were more varied from the 17th century onward, in contrast to the 15th and 16th centuries, where access to the Essentials of Koryō History was more common, but by no means universal. This pattern of circulation, conditioned by politics and technological affordances, had a long-lasting influence on the writing of history in the Chosŏn, specifically private history writing. This is not an argument for technological determinism, but an acknowledgement that access to information by means of archival control or the publication of historical sources patterns how we read and write history. In this case, how the Chosŏn elites read, wrote, and conceived of their history. Of course, a full account requires the examination of how the Chosŏn elites approached the text. And there's a number of different ways of reading or utilizing both of the two histories. I mean, reference, citing information in genealogies, recitation during royal lectures, marginalia and annotation, like note-taking as you're reading, note-taking in a separate notebook, excerpting the text, and of course, incorporation into new works of history. And to some degree or another, I examine all of these particular practices to track the pattern of reception at the micro level within the constraints imposed by the larger structural forces that I've been describing so far. Right now, I just want to focus very briefly on one aspect of the reception of the two histories, which I believe should demonstrate what I believe their impact was, and that is their utilization in private history writing about the Korean Peninsula. So private history writing in the early Chosŏn was generally small scale. The 15th century, of course, saw many massive historical compilations by the court, but private history writing is a lot smaller. And one characteristic of the 16th century, many scholars point out, is that the favored genre for private history writing was the abbreviated history, the saryak. And these were concise chronicles of only a few chapters covering the entirety of Korean history. And I suggest this favoritism towards abbreviated histories, or saryak, is related to the available sources, which included the comprehensive Mirror of the Eastern Country, which is, of course, a straight chronicle. It's just organized by chronology, not by kind of theme. And the Essentials of Koryå History, which is organized chronologically, but not the History of Koryå. History of Koryå is a far more complicated book, divided up into, as I mentioned, annals, treatises, timetables, biographies, but my argument is that it's not available, so people aren't using it, and therefore there's less information to go around in essence. So just briefly, here's an example of one of the several abbreviated histories of the early Chosŏn. This one is the captioned and glossed abbreviated history of the Eastern country, the Pyoje Umju Dongguk Saryak by Yu Huryong, and it relied heavily on the comprehensive mirror of the Eastern Kingdom. In contrast, there is a small explosion of private history writing on Korea in the late Chosŏn. While the reasons for this outburst of private historiography are complex, one of the factors is at least I argue, is that the now available and accessible history of Koryå provided the materials necessary for late Chosŏn scholars to engage in depth with the history of Koryå and conduct more detailed analyses of peninsular history at large. So from the 17th century, there are a number of high-profile private historical compilations by scholars that deal either with Koryå or rewrite peninsular history in considerably more detail than the Saryak genre. And I'll just highlight a couple. Most prominent are Yu Ge's outline of Koryå history, the Yosa Chegang, and Hong Yo-ha's selections from the history of Koryå, the Yosa. Both Yu and Hong complained about the complexity and cumbersomeness of the history of Koryå and tried to tame the massive quantities of information it contained by rewriting it into different genres. Both of their works could not have been written without direct access to the history of Koryå. If they had written without consulting the history of Koryå, they would have looked very different. Both books are very heavily indebted to the history, and like Hong Yo-ha's especially is just an abridgment of the history of Koryå with some additions here and there. Similarly, we know that An Chong-bok drew heavily on the history of Koryå when compiling his outline and details of the history of the East, the Dongsa Kangmok. An's work of history would look very different had he not had a personal copy of the history of Koryå, which he annotated heavily as part of his writing process. So when available, literati picked up the history of Koryå and Essentials of Koryå History and utilized them in new private histories of the Korean Peninsula. The Essentials of Koryå History flowed into short, abbreviated histories in the early Chosŏn. After 1613, the history of Koryå permitted the compilation of more complex works, and literati worked its copious records into new visions of the peninsular past. These new histories provided easier access to information about Koryå, sometimes becoming more popular reading material than the history of Koryå itself. Together with the history of Koryå, the history of Koryå and its spin-offs made detailed knowledge about the Koryå kingdom more prevalent in the late Chosŏn. Linking history writing to the availability, accessibility, and materiality of historical sources, I address how the medium of reproduction and mechanisms of distribution, and of course the politics behind all of this, constrained the ways in which history was read and written in early modern Korea. The Chosŏn court selected media of reproduction for political ends to create limited outcomes of circulation of the history and the essentials, which had long-term impacts on their reception and readership, much like issues of copyright and restrictions on archival access do today. In this way, we can say that the history of Koryå went from restricted access to published archive over the course of the Chosŏn dynasty, while the Essentials of Koryå History languished as a rare book. The material availability and accessibility of each text impacted the historical worldview and opportunities for history writing of the Chosŏn elite, forcing us to reconsider Chosŏn-era historiography within this understanding of the availability of sources. And just as Chosŏn period history writing was impacted by the constraints of contemporary media, we have to ask ourselves how the materiality of sources influences our own writing, be it historical, literary, or otherwise. That is, for us, like pre-modern scholars, we're using the Koryåsa, or the History of Koryå database, or the veritable records database. How is that changing how we write history, for better or for worse? So I will end here, and I very much look forward to all of your questions, and thank you very much for coming to listen to my talk. Thank you.
Okay, Um, Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating presentation. It was, well, I learned a lot about its circulation, well, production, circulation of Koryåsa and Koryåsa chorszá during Chosŏn dynasties. Well, I would like to ask our audience that if you have any questions, please feel free um, to turn on your audio video and ask your questions directly to Dr. Reynolds. And if you have any questions, please use the raise hand function. Is it so that I can call you out to ask your questions. So while we are getting questions from our audience, I think I would like to begin asking you the first question. So I thought it was very interesting how the textual production and also circulation became more active and increased during the late Chosŏn. And so I'm just wondering, I know your focus is more on the production of text, historical text, but I was just wondering, because there's been so much circulation going on, especially not just in the official space, but also in private space. Do you know what kind of historical narrative related to Koryåsa was constructed during the late Chosŏn? Because it just, I think I'm just curious as to know with all these circulations of these texts about Koryō, like what kind of narrative was constructed about Koryō during, or discourse, or like, so what was their main interest in learning about Koryō in this period?
That's a good question, and there's many different answers to that. I think so. Just to touch on a couple, some scholars have written about the challenge to the narrative of the history of Koryō in the late Chosŏn. So in the late Chosŏn, scholars are becoming increasingly critical of received wisdom about the fall of the Koryō, and not just the history of Koryō appearing, but like that some other documents come to light, or at least are presented more formally to the literati community, and then they start to cross-reference, and they realize that probably the history of Koryō has some fabrications in it, especially regarding to the two of the last kings, right? Shin-U, Shin-Chang. They're supposedly the offspring of the monk Shin-Ton, who was a favorite of King Kongmin. But because they're supposedly the offspring of this monk, then they're not the legitimate rulers anymore, and therefore the Koryō dynasty has already fallen, and therefore Isongye has a pretext to take over. And that is kind of the standard line in the early Chosŏn, and other texts in the Koryōsa also hold to that line. But then in the late Chosŏn, people start questioning that based off of other material. So there's kind of more critical engagement with a wider variety of sources, and trying to kind of tackle the narrative of the history of Koryō, and really questioning it, even though that can be quite dangerous. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is like an increased focus on loyalty. Chung leads people to rehabilitate a lot of the Koryō loyalists as well. So there's like you could maybe say local history, I guess, but this focus, on the Koryō loyalist, and even the Chosŏn government recognizing the Koryō loyalist does change the narrative of Koryō in the late Chosŏn. And a final note, so I mentioned I look at marginalia. And this is an ongoing thing, because it's kind of like tiny record by tiny record. But like one pattern I have noticed is people are interested in different books of the history of Koryō. It's 137 volumes. It's divided into annals, treatises, timetables, biographies. Now, where do people read the most? It's actually the annals and the biographies. treatises are so boring, people don't look at them that much. I mean, at least they don't annotate them. I don't know if they read them. A lot of treatises don't have any kind of commentary, but biographies often do, and annals do as well. So when people are reading the history of Koryō, they gravitate to perhaps the more narrative or the more kind of history of events thing, style of writing, rather than the treatises, which really just list government offices and their changes, or like the sartorial regulations of the Koryō court. So no one's really interested in treatises, with the exception of the treatise on geography, which seems to have a little bit more attention than other parts. So there's a lot going on, and it in terms of like thinking about Koryō, and I think part of it is just the increased access to information about it, in the form of the history and in the form of the offshoots of the history.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Because I think that standard narrative of the history of Koryō, of course, to depict the end of Koryō in a negative way, strengthens the legitimacy of the founding of Chosŏn dynasty, obviously. But toward the late Chosŏn, I'm just wondering if people were interested in learning more about, such as like daily lives of Koryō people, the customs, and or kind of sort of trying to understand Koryō in a more positive light. Do you see those kind of writings in the like the history writing of Koryō in late Chosŏn?
So far, not really. I mean, they do, again, they try and rehabilitate the loyalists, and so like, but how to say, so suddenly being a loyalist to Koryō doesn't automatically make you a traitor to Chosŏn anymore. So a lot of posthumously your reputation gets rehabilitated. Your ancestors might, or your descendants might receive slightly more benefits. So there is that change. And then they do start questioning the narrative of Shin-U and Shin-Chang. But like no one's really looking at everyday life, or like no one's really saying, oh, actually, because another part of the explanation in the history of Koryō, why Koryō fell, is like, oh, they were just too into Buddhism, like Buddhism was and corrupt practices. No one's really saying, oh, Buddhism is actually good. No one's questioning that part of it. So it's really kind of a limited form of rehabilitation and engagement. And I don't think, at least in the Chosŏn, but I mean, it's hard to say for the 19th century because I haven't read as much there. But like for up until the early 19th century, I don't think much along the lines of what you're asking is really appearing.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from our audience? Don, do you have a question? You're muted. Okay, good.
Oh, okay. I guess I'll go ahead. Thank you again for the presentation. It was really great to listen into. I just have a quick question. I guess going back to the delegitimization, because I know like Chosŏn obviously wanted to solidify when it couped the previous government. Did they ever use because I know Koryō was under Mongol domination for close to a century after the invasions ended and the government capitulated. And I know a lot of the government, like the royal family, had to marry with the Mongol princesses and whatnot. Was that ever used to try to delegitimize Koryō, or was that more seen just in a factual, like this happened and then later the domination ended? I was just curious if you knew anything about that. Thank you.
Right. Thanks for the question. I mean, not terribly. The history of Koryō is more concerned about the excesses of the military period, which happened right before the Mongol invasions. Within the history of Koryō, there's not too much explicitly using the Mongols per se to delegitimize the Koryō. I don't think, but of course, early Chosŏn elites themselves are I guess against Mongol practices. There are prohibitions against using Mongol hairstyle in the early Chosŏn and Mongol fashions. So there is a reaction against that, and presumably the Mongols are seen in a negative light. But the history of Koryō itself, a lot of it is more factual when it comes to the Mongol period, I guess the real distortions come in after the Mongols leave with King Hongmin onwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Don?
My question is, do you know how the circulation of the Koryõ text compared to the circulation of the Samguk Sagi and the Samguk Yusa? Were they also being circulated widely then?
Yes, so that's I need to get more information about that. But I can say that the Samguk Sagi had woodblocks way earlier than the history of Koryõ. I often get asked so why can't your project be done with any history? Like, can't you do it with the Shilluk? Can't you do it with the Samguk Sagi? And I think sort of, but if I did the Shilluk, which is top secret in the Chosån, and then you move into the modern era, it becomes more open access. Then that's a modern story. But then if you're talking about the Samguk Sagi, then that's actually kind of late Koryõ, very early Chosån story of how it would begin to circulate. So I'm not sure if the exact level of circulation, but like the Samguk Sagi had woodblocks by the early Chosån. That's about as far as I can say right now. So yeah, dangerously, I'm just assuming it's kind of there, which is what I'm arguing against in for the history of Koryõ. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Young?
Okay, thanks. This is not much of a question, but a sort of related comment. I wonder if it makes sense. So the fact that Tungguk Tongam was block printed for wider circulations than Koryåsa or Koryåsa chώρyo is interesting. And Koryåsa chώρyo was actually in much circulation, a wider circulation than Koryåsa itself. So Tongam is a different kind of historiography, right? It's from following the Zhizhi Tongjian of China, which is intentionally moralized in the praise and blame fashion, and list of historical events and their interpretations as well. So it is chronologically arranged, but what makes it Tongam is actually they identify who's the good guy, who's the villain, and who, how it affected the moral integrity of it. And in a way, one may even entertain that, well, by calling it Tongam, it's almost like an attempt to join the Tongjian tradition, the historical merge in a way. So and the kind of smaller circulation of official history itself, it's not really different from Chinese practice as well, because they also they kept official history most of the time in the palace, and it's not like they prohibited circulation, but it was their home in the palace. It's not because of the gigantic size of the official histories, but it was more or less an archive than historiography itself. In a way that so it's in more immediate circulation were more contextualized historical writings or often private writings in China. And it suggests us actually to further distinguish what we collectively call history or historical works, in the sense that there were endorsed history with proper interpretation, and then there were historical records that collected archivable or archive-worthy events as well. So I wonder if it makes sense.
Yes, I mean, that's a good point about the different kind of genres, and like another thing that I just mentioned in a throwaway line, right? Like these are symbolic compilations a lot of the time, right? So the fact that you wrote it and, well, maybe printed it is enough. People don't actually have to read it. There is a history of Koryõ, therefore Koryõ is over. And so in that sense, yeah, it doesn't maybe it's not that surprising. if you actually start to look at the larger context of what genres are supposed to circulate, what genres are not supposed to circulate. So genre is an issue that I'll have to address more. But like when I think you're exactly right. Like we need to start differentiating from like what's sort of just an archival record and or compilation are not meant to circulate and what is meant to circulate, because now people just assume they circulated, right? And then I'm trying to counter that narrative. At least with this is kind of chapter 2 and a bit of my book. This is supposed to explain why it's not doing what we think it's doing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, anybody else? Oh, is that a question from Minsu? Minsu Kang? Oh, you're muted. Thank you. Because I saw clap hands, so I wasn't sure whether it was a question.
Oh, yes, I do have a question.
Okay.
So I was wondering, in addition to the question of whether to make these texts widely available and so on, I also sense in that time period, and I was wondering if you're going to deal with this in your book as well, that there was some concern about objectivity, because my understanding is that in the earlier attempts to compile this history, there were officials who were punished because they were discovered to have distorted the writings to make their own families look good in the Koryō Chosŏn period. So there seemed to be a very contentious tension here between, on the one hand, using especially the annals of the last kings of the dynasty, and putting them in a negative light to legitimize the Chosŏn takeover. But on the other hand, there's still the concern with objectivity, right? I mean, when there's sort of egregious cases of distortion, they had to rewrite it and so on. And another example of that I find interesting is that in addition to the accusation of the last kings being from an illegitimate line, there's this vicious vilification of King Gongmin as a sexual pervert and all of that. On the other hand, King Gongmin gets his own little shrine at Chongmyo fairly early in the dynasty. And there's also the recognition that at least earlier in the realm, he played a crucial role in the sort of demongolization of Koryō. So what I mean, the question that I would like to ask you is on the one hand, they seem to be using this to distorting the record in order to justify the Chosŏn takeover. But on the other hand, there does seem to have been real concerns about objectivity and making sure that having to write and rewrite and re-edit and punish officials and so on. So I was wondering if that's also going to be part of your narrative as well.
Yes, definitely. That's chapter 1, figuring out exactly what they're arguing about, because they argue constantly about these histories. And you're exactly right. People got punished because they wrote incorrectly. And sometimes, I don't know, it depends because the very first time someone gets an order to compile a history of Koryō is in just 3 months into the dynasty, and Chongdo-jeon accepts the order. And he writes a history with a couple others, and then they present it to the throne, and everything's good. But we all know what happens to Chongdo-jeon. And then as soon as he's dead, his history starts getting trashed. And then one of the accusations is look, he's making his family look really good. And but then, that accusation itself, you have to wonder, because he's now, persona non grata and dead. So it's a pretty easy accusation to make. And later on, someone also gets punished for doing the same thing, including some ancestor's biography in the history of in a draft of the history of Koryō that people were like, well, should it really be here? It's just there because he's head compiler, and then that causes an uproar as well. So yes, they're very concerned with objectivity. But what do they mean by objectivity? What is objectivity when it comes to writing Koryō era historical terms. So people say, well, you should write as it was, right? Do you write using actors categories? Do you write using the Koryō terminology, the imperial terminology? And then some people say yes, and other people say no, it's not necessary because we're not Koryō. And so then, but then is that an objectivity issue? But then the people saying we should write as it was written are kind of like pro-objectivity, so to speak. And then the people who are saying we should write like according to now are like more, I guess, more realists, but also like, we all use language to describe the past that wasn't used in the past. So are we not being objective by doing this? So that is a large debate as well. And so when it comes to the history of the Shin'u Xinchang, it's all too easy, and I've been doing this too, like the narrative of the Koryōsa says, but actually the Koryōsa is the last of several compilations, which and those other compilations are no longer extant. And then, of course, at the time itself, presumably Isongge and company are spreading the rumor that they're illegitimate at that time. So it's not necessarily that a historian sat down saying, well, I know the true history of the end of Koryō, but I'm going to twist it. It's more, there's these rumors, but they've been turned into fact over the course of decades, and that it works itself into their in that fashion as well. So they probably, I think, they are being very objective, because it's for the compilers, at least by the mid 15th century, it is objective fact that Shin'u Xintang were the offspring of Shinton. If they had looked further, or if they were permitted to look further, maybe they could have overturned that so-called objective fact. But I think a lot of people are thinking like that as they're writing. So it's not somewhere along the line, there's some willful distortion, but not every compiler is like trying to distort the narrative, I would say. And then your question about individual kings, yeah, in that sense, they do record a lot of like nasty facts about other, King Kongmin and other kings as well. And in that sense, they're being pretty objective. They're trying to be fair according to their standards and record the good and evil of each monarch. So yeah, they do have their own kind of professional pride, so to speak.
Well, if I could have a follow-up. So this is a question that I'm in doubt myself. When I read the account in Koryōsa about Shindon being the real father of King Wu, it seemed blatantly obvious to me that this was just rumor mongering at the most base level, right? I mean, it reads like that because it doesn't. I mean, it says stuff like it has been said, and word has passed down, and so on. So, are you saying that I'm imposing sort of my own modern view on this? That in fact, for historians at that time, that through time that did sound more objective.
No, not necessarily. I mean, that's one way historians can write, like it is said, but I guess my point is, like, someone didn't sit down in 1451 thinking, oh, okay, how do we legitimize the dynasty? It's part of the narrative, part of the discussion all along, to a certain extent, anyways. And then the interesting thing is, like, when the history of Koryō does circulate, when other documents start to circulate, other scholars at the time, or like in late Chosŏn, that is, they start to question the narrative. Before, the narrative wasn't questioned, but then according to my argument, the history of Koryō wasn't circulating, and then you have abridged versions circulating, which might have not been so subtle in their description of the events, and therefore kind of portraying it more as a fact rather than like a possible fact. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Song-hee?
Thanks for a great talk, Ram. I have a question about, or a couple questions about the more like general historiographical aspects of Koryōsa, chォryo. I know you're more focused on the production and compilation aspect, but my first question is about kind of like the Koryōsa and chォryo's position in the larger, tradition of history writing, like Samguk Sagi, but also the virtual records. And So is one of the major differences in how it was compiled, like 삼국사기 was kind of retrospectively written, whereas the Chosŏn 왕조실록 was contemporaneous, like you have court officials writing, records of each king, whereas Koryåsa, they didn't have that sort of system in place. Am I correct in that? And how does that then affect like the Chosŏn 왕조실록's view of the kings compared to the more retrospective, maybe more politicized. Could you say it's more politicized as a result because of that more retrospective writing of history in the Koryåsa? And then my second question is, how do you think Koryåsa and Koryåsa chåryo affects contemporary, like today, historical understandings of Korea today? Because you have, now like a major series like the Korea Koran 전쟁, the Korea Khitan War drama on Netflix in Korea that's getting a lot of, a lot of praise and widespread views, and a lot of that seems to be based on the records written for the Koryåsa. And so yeah, I was just curious, how whether you think that contemporary understandings of Koryå are accurate, or if they're so heavily dependent on Koryåsa, what sorts of things might be missing and things like that. But anyway, thank you.
If I may, can I quickly add to Sang's second question, Graham? So, because I think in your book project, you seem to cover like the, Koryåsa, chåryo throughout the 20th century until today. Like it's covering, up to digital databases on Koryåsa and chåryo. So just wondering if you could just briefly, because you didn't get a chance to talk about it in your presentation, touch briefly on how kind of it evolved in the 20th century.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. So that's a very interesting question about retrospective history versus contemporary history, because the Chosŏn government, sort of in the context of talking about Koryå history, but not necessarily the history of Koryå, they do make different arguments about when you should write history. And some people say, let's just wait, because in time we'll be more objective. In time we'll have kind of consensus or 공론. But other people are like, no, we have to compile now. And then at that time, it seems very, the way I was reading it, it sounds like, because the people saying let's compile now were the people who were actually involved in the events. They want to have their version on record. And the people saying let's wait were less invested in the events. They wanted actually to have a proper discussion along the road. So in that sense, it's reversed. Like retrospective history is not necessarily more political than contemporary history, or at least they're thinking that retrospective history would be better than contemporary history. But I think at any point, like the narrative can get distorted. It just depends on who's writing and why they're writing, and so people writing at the time, like people who were involved with the fall of Koryå and the rise of Chosŏn, like Chung Do-jun, yeah, okay, he writes a history, it's going to be biased. But then like the people writing in 1451, yeah, they're going to have some different ideas, and probably they won't have Chung Do-jun's biases because they don't have to defend their actions, but they probably would still have their own slant on Koryå history. So it's, you just have to look on a case-by-case basis, I guess. And I hope that kind of answers your first question, Song-Ek. And then the kind of combined questions about the Koryåsa and chåryo today. So that's a nice way for me to talk about manuscript very briefly, because I didn't talk about manuscript before. So the mystery with manuscript is, despite the fact that Chosŏn is a very heavily kind of manuscript-based society, like manuscript is a viable method of making a book. Woodblock is too, of course. Movable type is used more widely than their neighbors. But of course, manuscript is key, because that's how the literati communicate, by letter writing or by writing their books. And so manuscript is like the foundation, so to speak. But then there's very, very few manuscripts of either history. And then why? So to put it very simply, I think early on there weren't enough copies circulating, at least of the history of Koryõ, to allow for manuscript copies. Or else maybe manuscript copies aren't as important, or else they didn't copy the whole thing, they just copied part, and that wouldn't show up on our radar as a copy. Then I don't know why no copies for the history or the Essentials of Koryõ History, because that supposedly was circulating, but I don't have any early copies. Once you get to the late Chosŏn, however, you have woodblock editions of the History of Koryõ, and then you have more manuscript copies. And I think it's just because there were, if you have the woodblock for this big history, you just try and get someone to print them rather than copy them. And maybe you copy them because there's one or two copies that seem to have been like copies from that time period. But then a lot of them are from really late 19th century. And I think that's because at that time, people are interested in the history of Koryõ, but there's no woodblocks anymore. By the 19th century, I don't think there's woodblocks. I can't find any evidence of them. So then the only way to get a new copy, short of printing an entire new edition with whatever technique, is to copy it by hand. And so there's a number of copies that seem to have that filled that function. And then there's also kind of partially printed, partial copies of printed, the printed edition or woodblock edition that have some volumes that have been replaced. And the Essentials of Koryõ History, there are manuscript copies as well, but these manuscript copies are all kind of early 20th century stuff because the Japanese are encroaching, and the Koreans are kind of working alongside them or kind of in competition to like collect materials about Korea, about old Korea, about historical sources. And this Japanese effort does kind of eventually flow into the Chosån Shihenshukai, the Committee on Compilation of Chosån History by the Japanese colonial government. But they have somebody at that point, around the first decade of the 20th century, finds a partial copy of the History of Koryõ Essentials of Koryõ History, and gets very excited and makes a copy and makes more copies. And so a lot of the Essentials of Koryõ History is kind of like, oh, this is a new important source, so we need to make a couple copies for our organization. And then the Chosån Shihenshukai actually prints the Essentials of Koryõ History in the 20th century. And so now we're moving into like the 20th century reproduction history. It prints it in 1932, I believe. And then it's a partial copy held now at Kyujangak. And then they realized that in Japan, there's a full copy. And then they reprint that in part. And then so now suddenly, by the 1930s, late 1930s, you actually have the Essentials of Koryõ History in circulation again. But in the lead up to that, they create the manuscript copies, which is where that comes in. The History of Koryõ gets printed in Japan in 1908, and then that was based off of a manuscript copy held in Japan. But then that's the only ones in the colonial period, and we have to wait until the post-liberation era to have South Korean and North Korean copies. And there's a lot, actually. And then there's I wouldn't have time to go through all of them, but you have a whole, it's just the diversity explodes because you have the facsimile copies where they just kind of photocopy the whole thing, and then you have like typographic copies where they reset it into movable type, and you have translations of varying types, and then the first complete and arguably the best translation was done by North Korea in the 1960s, and it's considered a high quality translation because it actually translates a lot of the sinograph terms, whereas the South Korean, I think nowadays on the online databases, it's pretty decent. But like the early translations were just like, okay, here's the Chinese phrase and here's like a couple endings. So they didn't fully translate, is the argument. So you have a lot more access just in terms of printed copies, and then you have translations. So people, even without heavy Hanman knowledge, can read more. By the 1990s, they create CD-ROM databases, also in tandem with creating CD-ROM databases for the veritable records, and these spread online very quickly afterwards. And so now we have several different databases with copies of the History of Koryõ or Essentials of Koryõ History with the slightly divergent translations sometimes. So That's the present era. And then so like in terms of access, it's like ubiquitous. You can find it on your smartphone if you wanted to. Like you could find several copies on your smartphone. But who's reading it and what's reading it? Like the different databases would have different affordances, I guess, different opportunities for people to read. Some of them are more like it's for doing research, and others are a little bit more like Naver has a translation of the History of Koryõ, which is a bit more, I guess, more. It's because it's just they put a bunch in a web page as opposed to like entry by entry in the Guksapyeonchon Wiwonhwae's database, because that's a bit more kind of how to say scattered. But then you can reorganize the information in the Guksapyeonchon Wiwonhwae's database as well. So sometimes you can compare Hanman and Hangul and show multiple entries of different things, different or of the same page, I guess. Significantly though, in a lot of I forget which, but definitely the Guksapyeonchon Wiwonhwae's Koryåsa database, the Shin-uch Shin-chang narrative, of course, that was put in the biographies of traders, right? Now, they don't relabel them, but they move them in the list of links to link to the different volumes of the History of Koryõ. They move them up to where they would belong in the annals section. So they're kind of starting to undo the editorial choices of early Chosŏn to, I don't want to say re-legitimize, but they are kind of reflecting our current understanding of Shin-u and Shin-chang, which are in scholarship these days just called Uwang Changwang. We don't say Shin-u Shin-chang anymore because we think it's a fabrication that they were the offspring of Shin-ton. But that is kind of changing the the digital structure of the book in the databases. And I guess, yeah, there's all kinds of ways that this might be impacting popular culture. And I guess just two very quick notes, because I've talked for a long time about this particular question. One is, what we think of important from the Koryõ is, Koryõ Celadon was not really, I mean, that was a big thing in Koryõ, but like it's not really a big thing in the history of Koryõ, because by the time Chosŏn comes around, they're not too concerned with Celadon. Celadon is rediscovered later in the 19th century. And how other people have written about how that kind of became a fad. Oh, Koryõ Celadon is the best Celadon, but like for centuries, Chosŏn that wasn't on the radar. And then the other thing about, right. So, I mean, when you read a lot of scholarship on Koryõ history, despite the fact that we know more about Koryõ now than like people in the Chosŏn did, arguably, it's really hard to escape the history of Koryõ or the Essentials of Koryå History, because like if you want to do any research about Koryõ, any textual research, you end up going back to the books, and the books have a particular structure. For instance, like it's pretty well organized, like, you know, kind of a rise and fall narrative. And when you get to Late Koryõ, it's like a mess. And yeah, maybe Late Koryõ was a mess, but also maybe people in early Chosŏn just thought Late Koryõ was a mess because that's what they've been telling themselves for decades. And you don't know we don't know. It's hard to track the exact bias of selecting materials, because when they were compiling the history of Koryõ, they were using like Koryõ Shiloks, Koryõ sources and stuff like that, but we don't have those anymore, so we can't compare.
All right. Thank you so much. I think, you know, what your talk and the discussions that we are having now reminds us how history is always constructed, reconstructed. So it's a continuation of reconstruction of history. And I think it's, you know, your work is really fascinating, how from Chosŏn to today, how, you know, Koryåsa and Koryåsa chώρyo have been continuously reconstructed. All right, well, I think that concludes our lecture today. Thank you so much, Graham, for your fascinating talk, and also for our audience for actively engaging and asking great questions. And well, this is the end of our Premodern Korean lecture series for this semester, but we'll resume in the spring semester. We'll have another 2 lectures coming up in the spring semester. So please look out for our emails on the next 2 speakers, and hope you all have a great end of the year. Thank you. Hope
Thank you very much.
Thank you.